Szanowni Państwo, dziś mam przyjemność polecić kolejną książkę naszego patrona, wydawnictwa Derezio, pod tytułem Prawdziwy Izrael, fałszywy judaizm, autorstwa księdza Jeana-Michel Gleize. Jest to, można by powiedzieć, teologiczny i filozoficzny tour de force o tym, czym jest judaizm, o jego esencji, metodą scholastyczną, prowadzenie ku prawdzie bez żadnej politycznej poprawności i zbędnych, że tak powiem, ekumenizmów. Tę książkę i inne znajdziecie w linku wydawnictwa Derezio, który to link jest dzisiaj załączony w naszym programie. Polecam bardzo serdecznie. Dr Michał Krupa.
Good evening, everyone. It's your host, Mike Krupa, again for drglobal, the English language podcast of Poland's largest conservative weekly. Remember to hit that like button and our subscribe button. It definitely helps our channel grow. Remember also to support us via Buy Me Coffee. That also helps us develop further programs and invite interesting guests just like the one we will host today. Guys, remember our patron is Derezio Publishing House. I usually do one snippet of a book for a Polish audience before each episode, which you probably saw. But remember, Derezio has a lot of other books for our Polish-speaking audience out there. You'll find books on the crisis of civilization, the current situation, the Catholic Church, and a lot of history, a lot of interesting titles to look into. So I definitely encourage you to do that. And as I said, reminder about the like and subscribe button to always keep us developing. Guys, today we have another fantastic guest with us. It's Slavic Week here at DR Global. Yesterday we had Professor Kachanovsky, and today we have another Ukrainian with us. He is Andrii Telizhenko. Andrei has a very interesting story behind him, so I'm just going to give you basically a very basic background, and we'll let our guest expand on this. But generally speaking, Andrei used to work as the former senior foreign policy advisor to the first deputy prime minister of Ukraine. Then he was head of protocol to the prosecutor general of Ukraine at the general prosecutor's office in Kiev. Then he moved to the United States, where he was the former third secretary at the embassy of Ukraine in the United States of America, and currently works as a political consultant and international relations expert. He is also well known as a whistleblower, but we'll get into that in our discussion with Andrei himself. Andrei, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure. I'm well. How are you?
Perfect. I'm good. Well, as I said, I gave a snippet of your background to our audience in the beginning there. I didn't want to do any spoilers because your history, your background is so interesting and what you've been intertwined with. I was wondering if you could begin with telling our audience why you became famous in the media world. Some people hate you, some people love you, some people find you interesting. If you could give a backstory of why you are where you are today and how all this occurred.
Yeah, you gave a great first stop on what I went through from the beginning, and then at one point I understood that my country, Ukraine, not just the corruption, the problems, but overall the situation, the sellout of the politicians to the Western deep state. That's what bothered me, and I came out and told the truth on what happened, especially witnessing firsthand most of that truth. The DNC Ukraine collusion, the 2016 presidential elections in Washington, where I was approached by the DNC and asked to work with them to find dirt on presidential candidate Donald Trump. That was the first story, which basically went viral for the Political article in 2017. And since then, that's when the media started to know who I am more and more, not just from my government work, but overall what I was talking about, what I witnessed. And then I was about to go down with that and say, no, I'm not going to continue, when I was approached by Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, and Senator Ron Johnson from the Homeland Security Committee of the United States Senate, and asked to testify. So I did. I provide evidence on the DNC Ukraine collusion, and then I also was the person who was involved and witnessed Hunter Biden and his dealings in Ukraine, and when he was on the board of directors of Burisma. So that's where I also gave my evidence and testimony to the United States Senate and to Rudy Giuliani, at that time the lawyer of President Donald Trump. So that's how people found out who I am, what I am, And a lot of it is that people say I'm a Russian agent, which I was labeled by the United States State Department and Treasury. And even though everything I said was collaborating right now with the unclassified documents by the ODNI. So no false evidence, no dangled information. Everything is true. Everything was confirmed again by the Senate. And unfortunately, here I'm sanctioned by the Kiev regime and by the United States government, and I'm still fighting for the truth, and I will continue. So thanks to you for that, for giving me also opportunity to do that.
It's interesting because when I talked yesterday to Professor Katsanovsky, he wrote an excellent book on the Maidan massacre, and he pointed out that the mainstream narrative about what happened is basically BS. He does a meticulous job in his work to show that it was actually, the people siding with the Maidan protesters that were shooting at their own people, people associated with Rice Sector, Svoboda, and so on. And he told me that when he was invited by a Polish outlet, Onet, they did an interview with him. It was supposed to be published online, but then, thanks to the intervention of the Ukrainian embassy in Poland, they didn't they didn't publish it. And I'm seeing the same semblance of in your activity, because you're sort of being sidelined by not only the United States but also by your own government in Ukraine. So you're sort of what I would call the real Ukrainian patriots in a way, because you're not Russian, you're Ukrainian, and you definitely have a different vision of what's happening in Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine in the past. So I was wondering if you could talk to us more about going back to 2016, 2017. You can confirm that there was an actual Ukrainian operation, stand by the president to make sure Donald Trump does not become president. I'm guessing that was the essence of what happened, right?
Yes, that's correct. President Poroshenko was the one behind this whole, basically together with the Democratic National Committee, this whole so-called political coup to block presidential candidate Donald Trump from winning the presidency. And they went on to do anything basically but to lie in the situation. It was, as I said, you mentioned, I was the third secretary in the embassy in Washington. I was advised to come there by the ambassador, Charlie. I was part of his team. And basically, I was appointed to oversee the election process. And also, due to my connections, I was in contact with the National Security Council of the Biden White House, which I was going back and forth on a regular basis during my appointment. And during that period of time, basically, I witnessed a couple of specters of that situation where, first of all, when we had a meeting in January of 2016 in the White House, where you had the Ukrainian prosecutors, you had from the head of NABU, the deputy head prosecutor of the prosecutor's office, Sakwarilidze, and Holodnitsky, the special anti-corruption prosecutor in the White House, talking to the Obama, Biden advisors of the president of the United States, Eric Shermanella, Liz Zentas, the FBI was the Department of Justice, and they told them, look into any Americans working with the former government of Ukraine. That was the first signal, January 2016. And they were talking about Paul Manafort. The only American working with Yanukovych, the former government of Ukraine, was Paul Manafort. So they were looking in, trying to get any financial details on him, and giving orders directly to the prosecutor's office of Ukraine to give them that information. The second sphere was when I was told to meet with the DNC operative Alexander Chalupa by the ambassador and his surrounding, and to collaborate with her and finding dirt on presidential candidate Donald Trump, for her to then give that information to Congress and try to get Trump off the ballot. And thank God I didn't collaborate with her, I didn't work with her, but I got back to the ambassador saying, what is this all about? These meetings, this work with the DNC, like we don't have to, like we cannot pick a side and work with. We can oversee the possibility of the situation, but we cannot get involved in politics like the Americans do in Ukraine or anybody else. But we're not that powerful to do that. Like he said, no. Poroshenko gave us an order to do that, and he's telling us that we cannot meet the presidential candidate Donald Trump. We only work with Hillary and her team. We can meet anybody else we want, but Hillary is the main target that we want her to win. That was the basically direct speech from the ambassador Charlie, and he said we should work with the DNC, should help them do whatever they have to do to basically find a presidential candidate Donald Trump in 2016 that he's a Russian agent. So this is how the story began. I resigned from my position at that time. I left back to Kiev. So they found out other ways to manipulate the so-called Black Ledger book, which was made in Ukraine and then sent copies, not originals, copies to the West and published by Western media, then going after Paul Manafort, which they basically put him to prison with that document, even though that document was never used as evidence in court. They actually just tried to destroy him politically, and then they went to court and other cases on him. So, and then went after kind of presidential candidate Donald Trump, his team, General Flynn, George Papadopoulos, which those names were put up to me by Ambassador Charlie also to give to the DNC and give any background I can find on General Flynn or George Papadopoulos, and basically try to give that information to the Democratic National Committee, whatever Ukraine has, that they're collaborating with Russia. So this is the story. It was there. It was fully organized, and that was just a small little piece of it.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, I mean, didn't anybody at the embassy, at the staff, and the ambassador himself have any sense that, hey, what if this gets out? What happens if they find out we were trying to collude with the administration at that time and the DNC? So you have a sort of, political threesome here. Didn't they have that kind of sense that, oh crap, we might be in deep trouble if this comes out, so we should stop? Like, what was the thinking inside the embassy at that time?
I told them that. I said, what if we get caught? What is going to happen next? It's going to first of all destroy the relationship between Washington and Kiev, whatever we had at that time. And the ambassador told me, said the president is backing this up, so he knows how to figure this out. And again, back to the president Poroshenko, that was the ambassador's words. Second of all, they are all in bed with the deep state and the Democratic Party. I can tell you that. The embassy staff, you can see the embassy in Washington, the other Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, they're all the same people going back and forth to their positions for years and years. Because why? Because they're in bed with the same deep state that is in Washington or other countries around the globe. They're selling out not just to the Democratic Party, they're selling out to the system, the deep state in that country, especially in Washington. Like a lot of staff members, I used to talk to a lot of Americans and work with them. I knew a lot of them because I grew up in the States. I went to university in Washington, D.C., and chose to come back to Ukraine and do something good. Yes, I made mistakes, but I continued my path. But those people, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them, chose to collaborate and basically make their life position to work for somebody else, not for Ukraine, and sold out. That's what they didn't care. They understood they will be backed up. Like Oksana Shugart, the deputy head of ambassador of Charlie, she lives in California, United States right now. The head of the PR of the press service of the embassy of Ukraine, she lives in the United States. Everybody, like, there's a lot of people, or London, or Washington, or like you go look at the Ukraine political system. A lot of these people sold out and came back to live where they used to work with or used to coordinate with. So they didn't care what would happen to Ukraine. They cared about themselves and how to get in bed and closer to the people they basically sold out to, so they would have a better golden parachute for them when they land and Ukraine has troubles. So this is what the reality is.
Well, it seems not much has changed in Ukraine. Actually, it's gotten worse. And if it was only corruption and deep state intrigues, that would be one thing. But now you have what, around 1 million and counting dead Ukrainians on account of this, in a way associated with this entire process. I want to switch to your motherland, your home country, Ukraine. I mean, we're neighbors. We're seeing the effects of the war here in Poland very well, basically all over the place, not only in terms of immigration, but also a lot of the intrigues that are happening in Poland, also with so-called Russian saboteurs. Each one happens to have a Ukrainian passport, which is very surprising, and only admitted later, which is, as I said, there's a lot of question marks around that. But I want to get your sense of where Zelensky is currently in the state of the war, because you can sort of feel that the ground is moving from under him. And if we know that Nabu, and I think you confirmed this, is basically under the tutelage of Washington. They came after Umerov. They came after, what's his name, Yermak. Do you think it's only a question of time before they come after Zelensky?
Yes, it is. And you mentioned Umerov. Umerov made a deal with the FBI when he was in the States because he's a U.S. citizen. Again, former Minister of Defense, the head of the National Security Council of Ukraine, a U.S. citizen. His whole family during the conflict living in Miami. Great deal. So they, of course, they could fight whatever, throwing anybody to the front lines without any training as dogs. So this situation, not just, it started long before. I mentioned this a year ago, right before President Trump came to power, that this might happen. And then in February, April, in March, April, I confirmed that there's a RICO case happening in the States within the FBI against President Zelensky and his surrounding. And that by the end of the year, there might be a shakeup with the government. I talked about this publicly for the last year, basically. So right now, what we're seeing, it is a shakeup of what it is. The regime itself is unstable in Kiev. Why call it a regime? Because I believe that the president today, Ukraine, I cannot call him president, he's a leader or the dictator, whatever became Ukraine, because Article 110, he has to have elections. He didn't have them, so he's basically not legit in his position. And the situation with the corruption itself, and not just the corruption, but the sellout of the country to leaders and coordinators from outside of the country is just overrated. It's mesmerizing with what is happening there. And I can tell you that Zelensky's days are numbered. Yermak basically was the fundamental piece that basically, when it was thrown away, that's why it was pushed so aggressively to put him away, because Zelensky's going to be next. If Zelensky would have kept Yermak, it would be harder to shake up the situation. Right now, the West is trying to shake up the situation and trying to do a coup in Ukraine with the help of basically the forces from inside, and they're preparing their ground to change the leadership to somebody that seems radical. Poroshenko, Zaluzhny is the same people who are there, who are going to continue the war, who are all coordinated by MI6 or the deep state CIA. And this is not conspiracy theory, this is real facts. Like Zelensky, I've been talking about also for a year that he's a British citizen, and now we're getting information that it might be true. And so this is all interconnected, and right now the West is just trying to shuffle the cards and this is the West's deep state. I can tell you it's official, but also together with the deep state, they're trying to show a different picture in Ukraine and change the leader to somebody more legit, but for him to continue the war and say, oh, there's a new leader in town in Kiev, he's legit, but he wants to continue to fight, so you cannot pressure him. You have to support him. So that's the idea behind this whole shakeup going down in Kiev. At the same time, Trump is basically being disinformed on what is happening on the ground reality in Ukraine. Because if the Washington would really want peace, I think there would be an executive order signing, getting all the CIA, and there's 20 CIA bases around Kiev, around Ukraine, get them all closed down, leave only the diplomatic corps, official the embassy of the states in Kiev, and then let all the intel groups out of Ukraine, which are coordinating the neo-Nazis that are basically so-called threatening Zelensky to stop if he stops the war, they're going to go after him. So everything is interconnected. Ukraine doesn't coordinate anything. The Secret Service of Ukraine coordinates the Nazis, but the Secret Service of Ukraine is being coordinated by outside of Ukraine and being told what to tell the neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. So it's all a mess up, which is right now being shaken up like spiders in a jar, going after each other for power grab. And they don't care about the people. Nobody cares who is in Ukraine right now about what's going to happen to the people. Because if Zelensky would care what would happen to Ukraine, he would have stepped down before all this were happening, because he knew that this was going to come. If I knew that this was going to come, I think Yermak and his surrounding did know also that it's going to come after them. He could have stepped down, signed a peace deal, and then let Ukraine go with a peace initiative, and then have somebody else take over peacefully for this process. But no, he stayed in power. He's still in power because he understands he's going to get shot, killed, or prosecuted, even though if he makes a deal for himself. Nobody's going to stick to that deal in the West.
Yeah, it does seem like even if he tries to, do what the president of Afghanistan did, he basically had loads of cash left on a plane and flew, I think it was to Dubai. They might not even let him do that. So, I mean, he's got a lot of knives coming out for him, that's for sure. Andrei, I'm of the opinion currently, with the 20 point peace plan, apparently, that Witkoff, Kushner, and Putin discussed at the Kremlin just on Monday, I think, or last week, that in this situation, you have sort of this core constituency within the Trump administration. I would call, Witkoff, Kushner, J.D. Vance, vice president, U.S. Army Secretary Driscoll, who was in Kiev recently, maybe a few other people scattered here in the Pentagon who are the sort of realist orientation that, yeah, we gotta wind down this war, and we have to come to terms with reality, not with unrealistic expectations of getting the Donbass back, but reality. So that's one faction. And the other faction, you mentioned them, is the deep state in the United States that is coordinating with a lot of official powers in Europe, telling them, don't worry about Trump, you keep doing what you're doing. And they're obviously aligned with Zelensky and his cohorts. Am I getting this assessment right? What's your take?
Totally, that's correct, and what's happening. And there are people within Trump's team that are trying to disinform him on the international situation, because he is a good management. He is a good manager. He's a good businessman, but foreign politics, for him, he needs advice on, and that's what some people in his administration are using that, giving him bad advice on Ukraine sometimes. But thank God we're seeing things are changing right now, and there's actually the reality is coming to sense that what Ukraine, the United States cannot get anything out of Ukraine. It was a mistake actually getting involved in all this from the beginning, because the whole idea, from how I see it, they wanted within the first 3-4 months of this conflict to use Ukraine, because Brzezinski, the advisor to Reagan before, and then a lot of other presidents, I met him actually when he was still alive, and his son then later on, talked about two Slavic nations fighting a war, especially very close Slavic nations like Russia and Ukraine, and then it's going to be used for that situation, for an uprising in Russia, to then go after the government there and take it down, and then divide Russia into different pieces to use it for its own national goods, which is over $73 trillion worth of natural resources in Russia right now at this point. That's what the World Bank information. But so that was the idea behind this whole conflict, to get Russia involved from the beginning, use Ukraine. Ukraine sold out. Ukraine is also to blame for it, especially the Ukrainian elites, the regime that basically sold out its people and its country, that for the Western passports and dollars, to have its own country used, and they actually believe that they're going to win. I know a lot of people in the Kiev government and the regime, and when I was still working there, they believed that they could win Russia, which was crazy. And this information was told to them by the U.S. embassy, by the U.S. government officials coming to Kiev. So I can imagine what's happening in the White House. But the deep state is working, and it's working not only in Washington. It moved a bit from Washington to Brussels and London. There's people like Bill Browder coordinating with the so-called opposition leaders from Russia in London, and then there's the Brussels itself, which basically now is a strong point for the deep state itself to go after and use again Ukraine for more money laundering, and try to go after, use this conflict to go after Russia, which is destroying its own European economy, which is just crazy. We're seeing what Europe has become. We have the strongest economy in Germany, and it's falling apart. Right, it's 0% of economical growth within the last couple of years, and this is just a tragedy for the people of Europe. And I can imagine also the same thing with Poland. That's the usage of Poland in this conflict has been basically used the country to go after something that they don't want to go after for. Poland is a thriving European country right now. I've been to Poland. It basically developed what Ukraine wanted to develop within the last 30 years, and even better. So this reality is that there's nothing to gain from Ukraine anymore. The U.S. has to focus on the Indo-Pacific region. That's what it has to actually focusing on. And right now they're using Ukraine to negotiate with Russia on the Latin American cycle. Venezuela, that's one thing. Also, they want Colombia, and they are looking into Brazil. So basically, they are telling Russia, look, we want also to work with you on the Arctic. We want to work with you on other economical aspects, your natural resources, that's great. But why don't you give us Venezuela, give us Colombia, give us basically Latin America, the Pan Americana world? We want it back. And then we'll go after China in the Indo-Pacific. That's what the US is going for right now. That's why they're still keeping Ukraine in grabs and not leaving Ukraine. I said they could have done that 24 hours, and Ukraine could have gotten some sovereignty back at least. But no, they're using Ukraine for trade, and even those people who you mentioned are going for the national interest of America, of course, and using a lost country, country that they're financing fully today, to do another power grab around the globe. And unfortunately, that's the reality. And my country, my motherland, is being used as a rag today in trade between the superpowers of the world, Russian Federation, the United States. And that's a tragedy because people are still dying every day because of that tragedy. It could have been avoided. We could have gotten back Donbass within the Minsk Accords as an autonomy, and it was a reality. I was part of the Zelensky inner circle at one point because I was working with people who financed him before the elections, and he was supposed to go to Donbass and talk to the people of Donbass after he got elected and say, we want you back and we want Ukraine to come into Donbass again peacefully and we want to be reunited. That was his plan. And there was already that plan on the table and it was coordinated with different groups, but it went other ways. Unfortunately, history saw a different course. And today, the reality is Ukraine cannot get back Donbass, Crimea, or anything else. It didn't lose them just military-wise. It lost them because it didn't support its people. Within the last 30 years of Ukraine's independence, zero investment in Crimea, only stealing money. Within the last 30 years of Ukraine's independence, zero investment in the Donbass eastern area, eastern Ukraine area, only taking the coal, the natural resources, selling them, power grabs, and that's it. People were poor. People had no prospects. People had no future. So of course they stood up and said, "You don't want to go the path that you're telling us to go. Even get things are going to get worse." And it did get worse for the other Ukrainians who said no, who said yes, we want to go to the so-called EU future, NATO future. Look at Ukraine. There's no Ukraine. Unfortunately, my country economically is fully on life support. Politically, there's no sovereignty or independence. Military-wise, the army is destroyed. It's made up out of farmers and people who don't want to fight this war. 80% of Ukrainians don't want to fight this war. And I've been talking to people on the ground. The military are saying, we don't care which flag flies over Ukraine today. We just want peace. We lost. We understand that. And the lifespan of a Ukrainian soldier on the hotspot is 4 hours. That's this average. So you can imagine how much death there is, and it can be stopped, but nobody cares about it because people are fighting for power and money, and none of these countries that we're talking about don't care about the Ukrainian people.
It's a sad memento when you have an entity with so much potential as Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, which could have, in some, let's say, there wasn't so much corruption or even a modicum of it, and you had competent government. I mean, Ukraine should have been the Kuwait of Europe in many ways, right? Obviously, there was a lot to loot, unfortunately, but I mean, even let's say this peace plan works out, the goal is to still have an entity called Ukraine with nominal sovereignty and with borders, obviously, corrected after what happened in February 2022. But let's play a little bit of fiction here. And let's say you were advising a much more sober leader than Zelensky right now in Ukraine. Russia isn't going anywhere. Belarus isn't going anywhere. 3 Slavic nations, huge Orthodox traditions, many connections. I read an article somewhere recently where somebody stated that, it might be heresy to say, but the only guarantor of Ukrainian security might actually be Russia, not the West. That Russia is the only entity capable of providing Ukraine with long-term security. Now, I know to a lot of people that's anathema. That sounds like heresy because you've been, conditioned to think otherwise thanks to the mainstream media. But here we have a person from the inside, and I want to get your opinion on such a controversial statement, Andrei.
No, it's not a controversial statement. It's reality. Like people are saying that Russia is something from like Mars. It's not. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union for more than 70 years. Our capital basically was in Moscow. And before that, for more than 350 years, we were part of the Russian Empire. And we have one church which has a 1,000-year history, even during the Rech Pospolita and the Litovsky kingdom over Ukraine, more than 800 years ago. It was still the Moscow church, which was dominant in Kiev. And at that time, Kiev was there. There was no Ukraine, but there was Kiev. And during even the Cossacks, the Hetmanshina, the Moscow church was the one who appointed the priests to the hetmans, even though they were fighting the Moscow kingdom at that time. So we have a long history, and there's a long interconnection towards today's Ukraine, the territories there, and Russia itself, and that's the reality. Ukraine's uh, sovereignty and independence and security guarantees, as you said, does depend on Russia itself and on Ukraine. Ukraine can guarantee its own sovereignty and its own independence and own security by saying we are a neutral country, not an anti-Russia, and that's it. You don't need NATO, Fifth Article. You don't need nuclear weapons for that. Thank God today Ukraine doesn't have its nuclear weapons capability. Because can you imagine today's Kiev regime with nuclear weapons? That'd be World War III, and that's done. Thank God the history went otherwise, because I was thinking about that a lot throughout the years. And right now, what I would suggest is take the peace plan that we have, because every time it's going to get worse. Ukraine did not lose. The Kiev regime lost. The elites lost because they will have to flee. They will have to find where to go. Before, they could have went to Moscow and had their safe haven there with nobody touching them. Now they have to trust the West. If the West will take them in and not prosecute them for their basically stealing their own people's taxpayer dollars of the United States and European taxpayer euros. So they're going to have no stability. So the elites lost, the Kiev regime lost. Ukraine can win from this by saying no to war, ending, stopping the killings. We're going to save the people that we have a neutral government which will come into power, sign any peace arrangements, not the Zelensky regime. We cannot have the neo-Nazis, the Banderites in power, because those people, it's a cancer in the heart of Europe. It's only going to grow if you leave it as it is right now. You cannot keep it there. Basically, have a neutral sovereign government which is going to say no to aggressiveness of anti-Russia politics within the country, no to killing of the church, of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and destroying its history, no to destroying its history at all. Let's regrow what we have. Let's rebuild what we can and move forward on. We had the Ukraine had its so-called independence 100 years ago under Rushevsky, Skoropadsky, and then Petlura. It didn't work out pretty well because it was all also coordinated from outside of Ukraine. It was never got its own idea. It was all pushed on from outside of Ukraine. And a lot of Ukrainians, and I can tell you 99% of Ukrainians speak Russian, and they understand Russian. And a much lesser number speaks Ukrainian and understands Ukrainian. So that's the reality on the ground for Ukraine today, the fundamentals that we have to understand. There's ethnical and historical backgrounds for all these processes, not just politics that you want to push onto the country and say, this is what it is and we have to believe it. No, it doesn't work out that way. I would advise take the peace deal that is on the table right now, because that's actually, you actually have people talking to you from both sides saying, what's your take on this? Russia's actually saying, we're ready to negotiate. They could have just said, no, we're going to bombard the hell out of you, move forward. Like the situation in Palestine, Gaza, there's total destruction, or America and Iraq bombard Baghdad, 150,000 dead within the month. Civilians, not military, civilians. And people would say, oh, it's for democracy. And I said, Russia could have done that and moved forward. No, they don't want to do that because it costs a lot of man life for them also. It costs economically for them. It's over $1 billion a month to pay for this war. So it's a lot of money. You have to also consider that the fact it's not just bad Russia, evil Putin or whatever. You have to think, people think economics, people think numbers. And that's also to put into consideration. So I would put that advice on the table for somebody who would be in Ukraine today, a sane person, and who would listen, and we'd go from there. Just to save Ukraine. And as I said, 100 years ago, Ukraine had its so-called independence for a couple of years. Then we had the civil war between the White and Red Army, which led to today's territory of Ukraine joining the Soviet Union. More than from 8 to 15 million dead during that period of time. But still, we got united as one country, and we won the Second World War, the Nazi Germany together. So things change. People just need to get it back on track, on peace track. And the people want to do that. And that's what we have to do. We have to think for the people and what we have to do to accomplish to restart the country back again. And by doing that, telling the truth, what really happened behind these last 10, 15 years in Ukraine, what happened with the coup in 2014, what happened after that how the government, not just corruption, but collaboration with Western entities selling out its country to somebody else, not just somebody who was close to you for hundreds of thousands of years, that's also bad, but somebody across the ocean who doesn't care what your future of the country will be because it's not in their national security interest, it's just in the interest to use you. And that is the biggest problem. So that's what we have to rebuild and redo because there's also corruption is always and everywhere. It's a bad situation around the globe where there's politics, there's corruption, but collaboratism and where there's people selling out your country, traitors, that's the biggest problem.
Well, Andrei, let me tell you, the problem of comprador elites is not only a Ukrainian problem, sadly. I can go into chapters about what's happening in Poland, but you mentioned how many Ukrainian officials have dual passports. Well, I can tell you that our foreign minister, Radek Sikorsky, his wife is obviously Anna Applebaum. Sometimes I get the impression he's more Applebaum than she, but you get my gist. Anyway, he admitted actually just over a year ago, and I didn't know this until the admission was made, that one of his sons is actually serving in the United States military. So there you go. Our foreign minister has a child in the U.S. Army, but nobody's pulling any strings. Don't even think about that because that's conspiracy theories. Anyways, as I said, it's not only a Ukrainian problem, although obviously in Ukraine it's it's of a gigantic magnitude, bigger than in Poland, sadly, but it's what it is. Andrei, I want to also get your take on, because you mentioned, the neo-Nazis. We've been told years that first there were neo-Nazis in Ukraine, then there were no neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And even if now there's a new narrative, and it's also being propounded by a lot of liberals and Ukrainian liberals who are actually living in Poland and taking money from NGOs, who say that yes, there was Bandera, there was, the Volhynia massacres, but this was an expression of Ukrainian independence. And the most important thing is it was directed against Russia. So we as Poles have to support this, which sounds crazy if you consider what happened in Volhynia in 1943, the massacres against Polish citizens. We remember, very vividly remember what happened. And I was wondering, when Putin talks about, not only demilitarization, but also denazification, organically speaking, do you think current Ukrainian society has enough power within itself to root out this problem by itself? Or do you think there will be greater splits after, God willing, as quickly as possible, the war ends in Ukrainian society?
Of course, there's going to be splits. The radicals are now in it's a greater minority than they were before a couple of years ago, even though the conflict is still on. The people are seeing, the regular Ukrainians are seeing that they don't want to be connected to the Nazis or the Banderas or the neo-Nazi regime. I can tell you that there are neo-Nazis and they're Nazis in Ukraine, not just from my words. When I was in a position to advise to the first deputy prime minister, we had a meeting with the German ambassador in Kiev. This was April 2014, right after the coup, free so-called Ukraine. And he came to us in a very turbulent situation, and he said, "Look, I was just on the streets in Kiev, and that's when the Azov battalion presented itself in downtown Kiev and said, I want to pass a message to you and pass it on to the acting president at that time because there was no president yet. It was still the government process. That this has to stop because this is going to lead to a very radical and problematic situation because you have Nazis on the streets. And the symbols of those battalions that we are representing in downtown Kiev right now, under the protection of police, they're Nazi symbols. Stop it, please, because it's going to lead to bad political structure in Ukraine and aggression from Russia, and it's going to lead to something bad that we don't want to lead ourselves. So this is the German ambassador in 2014. Mm-hmm. Of course, it didn't stop because the Azov battalion, the right sector, Aidar battalion, there's dozens of them, of those so-called neo-Nazi battalions and groups in Ukraine, because it didn't stop. Because why? It was supported by the CIA and the MI6, right long before even the coup in Ukraine, right after the Orange Revolution, and through the security service of Ukraine, they basically helped coordinate and recruit guys into those battalions, into those groups, and they basically finance them and coordinate them politically. There's the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C., where a lot of these folk who from the Avakov circle, Homparubi circle, the leaders of the key regime, they went and studied in Washington and did internships in the Jamestown Foundation. And Jamestown Foundation is former CIA. And so this is, I've been there in their office, and actually they're proud that they had these people there. They coordinated these neo-Nazi battalions. So this is what it is all about. Again, foreign influence, no conspiracy. This is reality. This is the realistic situation on the ground. And there are Nazis in Ukraine. And why they chose the Nazis, the Banderas, because they are, again, traitors and collaborators of their own country. You cannot choose hetmans from Ukraine like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who at one point got a common sense and made peace with Russia and had good relationship with also with Poland at one point, then going back and forth. But they were statesmen at some point. They had representative of the people at that time. But Bandera, no, he's a traitor. He is a collaborator with the Nazis, and that's why they chose him. And also because of the diaspora outside of Ukraine, which is living in the United States and Canada and Europe, who fled after World War II. And their fathers and grandfathers were collaborators working with the UPA, UNONSO, and all these groups, basically working for Bandera. And they're now in state government positions in Washington and Canada and Ottawa and London and Brussels. And they're pushing this idea because it was a good idea to push. No history behind that. Very bad reputation of this so-called Bandera regime. So you can say, yes, it's bad, but some people like it. And it's good to use in the Ukrainian society, but the people don't like it anymore. Some people don't even understand why they call Banderas in Ukraine, because they say, we don't know who this guy is. We don't, why our government is doing this. We don't understand. So people don't even understand what is happening. So the radicals, it's a minority of them left now. Russia is doing its process of denazification pretty well with destroying all these neo-Nazi groups, but the leaders of the neo-Nazi groups are not fighting in the front lines. They're taking money, collecting millions of dollars from being in Lvov, being in Kiev, being outside of Ukraine. And that's going to be the biggest problem after this war ends. What is going to happen? Because these guys are preparing to flee. From my information, there's people within the Azov battalion. There's families, a wife and a husband and a daughter who are actually serving in one battalion, fighting and making money on this and whatever. They're going to sell all their real estate in Ukraine and going to flee to Europe. So Europe is going to have this whole problem next. What's going to happen? They're going to go through Poland. They're going to go through all these checkpoints, and then they're going to go back and they're going to hate the West because they didn't support them until the end of the pre-Ukraine as they saw it. So this is the reality. Ukraine is going to face a lot of turbulence after this. We're going to face a lot of problems after this, and Europe is going to face them, the ones that actually still continue to finance this war. And people like Sikorsky you mentioned, they should start thinking about that and what is going to happen and what can happen to Poland itself if these people start coming back from the front lines in a majority, not just 1 or 2 or 10, which are now causing troubles in Europe, but in dozens and thousands and going through borders with Europe. So that's the first thing we have to think about. And as I said, things like the Volyn tragedy and other historical backgrounds that were involving neo-Nazis, people who work with the Nazi regime, have to be approached and have to be united, and we have to sit down as our countries together and basically apologize and say this happened and put this thing over with, because this is not Ukraine, because should not be government politics to support and back these issues. It should be something left long behind us and move forward with something in a better future. And this is how I see it. It's not what Ukraine has to fight for with Poland after saying, because, it's part of the Ukrainian government. No, it's not part of any Ukrainian government. If it is, the Ukrainian government today is neo-Nazi, which it is. It has to be demolished and has to be cleared out with something better and something new.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I always believe that the future of Ukraine and in Polish-Ukrainian relations is Ukraine is basically stable and predictable, and that's in the interest of everybody, in the interest of the Ukrainian people, of the Russians, the Belarusians, the Poles, everybody. I mean, there's a commonality of our Slavic heritage, despite the many differences. They say a Slav will always get along with a Slav better than a Slav and an Anglo-Saxon. But we have so many outside entities going inside our region that they make these these sharp differences even more acute, which they shouldn't exist. I totally agree with you. And we can't ignore the fact that you take into consideration all the nations, including Russia, which obviously is being considered the boogeyman, the evil empire. Andrei, I could ask you so many other questions, but we ran out of time. I hope that we can count on more discussions with you here on DR Global in the future. Your insight is fantastic. We really needed to hear this coming from a Ukrainian, somebody who served at the top. So hopefully we'll be seeing more of you here on DR Global. And for today, from all of us here, thank you once again for coming on, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. God bless you all. All the best.